Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, Director of Marketing and Development for the YMCA of Northwest Louisiana, and we're here at 318 Latino Studios for Shreveport-Bossier, my city, my community, my home. And I always say we have a special guest, but we have a super special guest this week. We have the one and only Maggie Martin. Maggie, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Of course. Well, I'm excited to speak with you, and I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. You've been an institution in Shreveport journalism. I read that it was a dream come true for you to be a journalist, one you chose many years ago when you were a young child reading the Times on your stoop in Queensboro.
That's exactly right, and that's all I ever wanted to do.
So my question is, what was it about journalism that spoke to you?
I think it was the feature stories in the Shreveport Times. And when we took both the Times and the Journal in those days, but I always liked to get it before my father got there, because once he got there, you gave the paper to him. But I know one story that feature story, Patsy Farmer was her name. Some people that read the Times in those days might remember her. And they were rolling people's houses. Do they still do that?
Oh, yeah, I did.
And then, so she came and picked me up, and the photographer, Lloyd Stilley, I believe, was the photographer. And he's Lloyd's still living, but he was famous for his feature pictures. He was really good. And we had permission to roll their house. That was one of the feature stories. But I guess I read almost all those stories, but all the stories in the paper, and I read the comics. But I especially was taken with the feature stories. And you were talking about earlier about the plane crash on Caddo Lake. Was it Caddo? Wallace Lake. And I happened to listen to Walter Winchell. We always listen to the radio, listen to Walter Winchell. All the people in the, anyway, he introduced himself as Walter Winchell and what he was talking about. And I was listening to the radio that night, and he came on and said headline Shreveport, Louisiana, and it was that.
Wow.
And that was another thing I think that interested me, that he was talking about Shreveport. So that's why I wanted to be a reporter always. In college, I got involved in the speech department and helped them, and so I kind of think, well, maybe that would be interesting. And I guess every young girl growing up in those days thought about flight attendants, but I never wavered from wanting to be a reporter.
I love it. Well, you began, if I'm not mistaken, working with the Times in 1964.
Just out of grad school.
But not initially as a society reporter you would later become. So my question for you is, when did you first begin writing columns on society parties and such?
Well, I did a column on the Revel. They sent me down there because I love to write about people, and I like little small details. So they sent me down to do the Revel, and I did the Revel, I think, probably every day. And then I think
started in 1976, I think.
Yeah, in 1976 when they started. I would come down here and interview different people at the different venues, and that is how. And then I also did a column, I think, on fashion at one point. But I would just, and your stroller, do you remember the stroller that used to run on the front page? You probably don't remember that. But it was a small little column, and we would write about people, and I would find like a lead on something that was going on in the city that day. Any reporter can contribute to it, but I did a lot of that doing this little stroller. They took the stroller off the Times, but I don't know if you read the New York Times, but they have a column called the Metropolitan. It's very similar to our stroller, the stroller we did in those days. And then I just would, there were other society columnists, Betty Lane Quirby's was, and Viva Begbie was also, and I loved the way she wrote. So I kind of just ooched into that, and I started. I still did other stories. You may have this as a question. A team of us were finalists for the. I'll wait and let you ask the question. But so I did other stories while I was doing the column, but then the column became bigger and bigger, and people wanted to be in the column.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
People wanted to be in the column. They wanted to be spoken about, and they wanted to be photographed.
They did. The photos were and of course we would take more pictures than you could get in that column. Though at the toward the end, they did 2 pages of pictures because that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see. And there was a nun one time at Schuetze, and she said, "Oh, Margaret," she said, "you made me a dot and dash." I can't remember what had happened when I saw her, and she said, I was a dot and dash, and she was so excited about being a dot and dash. Even that was just a little teeny tiny at the bottom of the column.
Well, you made a lot of people celebrities.
Well,
seriously,
they enjoyed doing it, and I enjoyed doing it.
Well, tell me, I didn't allow you to prep for this, but I thought you would have it just there. I want you to tell me about 1 or 2 of the most memorable parties you ever covered. And it can be anything. It can be as far back as you want. But I want you to kind of set the stage, because I know you've been everywhere and anywhere in this community for the last long time.
Well, there were lots of them, and I did a family whose cottage had just been named to the National Register, and that was not a big party, but that was a small party, and it meant a lot to them. Everything you wrote about, no matter who, I don't and did not do just wealthy society people, but 2 of the ones that this will probably amaze people, because I did big stories too, covered the inauguration of a couple of the governors, but Tommy Whitehead, who a lot of people know because he's considered a world authority on Clementine Hunter. There's a Murphy Oil Company in El Dorado, and the head of that, it was a woman, it was a good friend of Tommy's, and she gave him a 70th birthday party at Cherokee Plantation in Natchitoches. And I think there were maybe 10 of us. And she had, I think the waiter that waited on us wore tuxedo, and then they all had uniforms. There were 2 or 3 people waiting on us, and it was this old house, and they never lit the fire, but they lit the fire that night, and we all were dressed, and it was the candlelight, and it was so very, very special that one very small party. And I did a wedding similar to that at the country club, and I did not know this girl very well, but she had
Shreveport Country Club.
Shreveport Country Club, which of course does not exist anymore. But she had candlelight. We had to be somewhere else that night, but we were able to cover that. And maybe there were 50 people there, but it was similar. Those to me were very special. Now,
just the level of intimacy, just how
yeah, exactly, and
small
scale, and the way they waited on us, and it was just those 2. I remember they were very special. Now I've covered all of the Christmas in the Skies. I did 2 the female governor, help me here. Blanco. I went down and covered that inauguration and that ball. And those are, and of course, Christmas in the Sky is very memorable, but so have the debutante balls are really interesting. And
you cover those every year.
Yes. And I did go one time to one out at the Shreveport Country Club again. And when we got there, and it was a wedding. And we got there, and as soon as we drove up, the Parkers came and said, "Oh, Miss Martin, Trump's daughter is here." And so I went to the bar, and Delton Harrison was there, the Renaissance man of all Renaissance men. And he said, "Margaret, Trump's daughter is here." Now, this is before he was running for president. And it was glittery. I mean, everybody in town was there. And so Delton took me over there and said, you have to stop talking to everybody and talk to Margaret. And everybody just kind of moved away, and we got a picture of her. Now, she's married, Ivanka isn't, yeah, she's married, of course, to someone else. But that was just magical. That was really a magical, and probably one of the top celebrities in the country that what was there. She was a friend of somebody who was invited, and they invited her to come along with them. So that was probably one of the most exciting, and the fact that people were helping me get there, and that and I didn't have to walk away or wait for anything. With Delton there, he just kind of shoved me in, and everybody kind of moved back. So that was one of the most exciting ones that I've done.
Well, you earned that, and
yeah.
I mean, everyone wanted to speak to you, and everyone wanted to be seen.
And we shot
by
other
you.
pictures of other people, So yeah, but that was one of the most exciting ones.
Well, you went there a little bit, but you were part of the Times Enterprise team, a group of reporters and editors that investigated the late Shreveport Public Safety Commissioner George Dartois.
Right.
The entire Enterprise team was actually a finalist in the 1976 Pulitzer Prize competition. So my question about this is just tell me about Jim Leslie a little bit, and some of your memories, just general memories of working on this Enterprise team.
I have to tell you this, that to start it off, we got a letter from the Pulitzer judge, and he said, I know almost is not enough, but you almost won the Pulitzer. But I noticed the New York Times, when they have a reporter like that, they'll say nominee, Pulitzer nominee, so we can all say that as well.
Which is incredible.
Yeah, well, we had a deep throat. The police chief was our deep throat. And he talked to Raymond McDaniel, who's kind of a legendary editor and who hired women in those days. And so he sent us, first of all, to the finance department. This is how it started at the Shreveport downtown, at Shreveport City Council building. And he told us, he said, look for every check that Dartois asked for, the money. Now, I believe that this is still correct. When you have a source, when detectives have a source, they have to list the source. I don't think they list the name, but they have a code. And what happened really was interesting. The room was a tiny, tiny room, but where they kept the finance records. There were no computers in those days. It was all, and Orland Dodson was there, Lynn Stewart, J.L. Wilson. There were about 6 of us, and there would at some points there would be all of us would be in that little room and would check in everyone. And he gave $2,000 every 2 weeks for secret sources. But one of the women that worked in there, they were working in there too. She said, I don't know what y'all are looking for, but you ought to check the commissioner because he's asking for $2,000 for sources every 2 weeks, and he is not paying sources every 2 weeks $2,000. But that's what we all just looked at each other. But as going through them, I kept seeing one to Jim Leslie, and it would be scratched out. And so I'm not even sure the rest of the team realized what was going on. And so we kept, and there were 4 or 5 of those checks. And so later, Jim Leslie said to us.
And Jim was what?
Jim Leslie was, he had worked for the Times and I think covered the legislature. He was a public relations person. He was also working on the right to work bill at the same time this was going on. And he was much loved by everybody. And he told Raymond McDaniel at one point, he said, I'm scared. And he said, I'm out there all by myself. Well, I had gotten a tip we were getting all kinds of tips from all kinds of people. And he said, Margaret, I'm not going to tell you who I am, but you do know me. He said, I work out at the airport, the old airport, which is north of town. And he said, there was a fight at Oaklawn in Hot Springs. And
That's right.
he said, there was George was up there with Red Box, and Red Box was a gambler, and we could call him a gambler because he had been convicted of gambling. I'm not sure what the charges were. And he said, if you go up there, there was a fight, and George is listed as a witness. And I think he took a city plane up there, and that's not legal. And I said, if you will just tell me who you are, I will never reveal my sources. I did not want to go to jail, but I would not reveal my sources. And I said, none of us will. He said, I'm not going to tell you who it is. But he said, so we called up there at the clerk of court's office. I think that's right, where they were listed. That case was listed. So I ran out the door, and they handed me money, and they called and got me a plane ticket to Hot Springs. Well, Jim was coming in the next morning, and Jim Leslie being our source for this. And so Raymond said, Jim, come on in, and I will talk to you, or somebody else will interview you. Margaret has gone to Hot Springs. And that's when Jim came down and told Raymond McDaniel, the editor, that he was scared. And I think it was probably about a week later. Oh, and he was headed the right to work bill. Mm-hmm. So they passed the bill in the legislature at some point in the day he was killed. And it was 3 a.m, and he was coming into the motel, and there was a fence there. It's right around the corner, as I understand it, from the Mississippi River. And he was shot in the back and killed. But because the right to work bill was so acrimoniously, am I pronouncing that correctly? And they said, a lot of people thought that the labor people had shot him, but of course he hadn't. They found out. And later, some of the reporters, some of that team, talked to some of the detectives, and they said that George had ordered that hit, and that he had told somebody. And we could not get anybody to tell us that. Though Sam Burns, who was one of the detectives, called me a couple of years ago. And it's one of those things that you wish you had made an appointment at that moment, but you didn't. So I think he might have told me if I had gone and had lunch with him. I just did not. Well, I admit I did not do it at that time. This was more recent.
And did y'all ever? I can't remember. So
they didn't find the gun.
But you were doing all this work against Public Safety Commissioner Dartois. Did this ever amount to a case against?
Well, I will tell you that Charlotte Burroughs, after we went through all those checks, we spent 6 weeks up there, and we went through all those checks time after time. And Charlotte Burroughs and I did go up to George. We got an appointment with George. And so I don't know if you knew George or not, but
never met him.
He just talked. And Charlotte said, and she covered City Hall, and she had covered George for years. She said, George, you are supposed to have, if these are all secret sources, you are supposed to have a coding. And she explained it all to him. And he said, well, I have this. He handed us a box with just a bunch of nothing in it. There was no list. There was nothing. And so we did a story for the next day for, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, in which we explained all. But the city, George had become and he was very, very conservative, and I understand the prisoners were treated horribly. He had just put that stuff together, and it didn't give us anything that would have showed that he was innocent and that he did keep it. He just did get. And Charlotte said, well, this is not what we need, George. This is not a record. You're just handing us a bunch of stuff. And I don't know if those were her exact words. I can't remember. But so then we did a story. But the community was not upset over George anything happened.
So you did a story that kind of exposed him,
explaining all of that. Yes, and we did.
But nothing really.
Nothing. And he ended up dying of a heart attack. He was in Houston. I think Cooley either operated on him or saw him, and Cooley being a well-known, famous heart surgeon, and one of the first heart surgeons. And then we were all in a meeting when he ended up in the attic of somebody's house, his house, I think.
In Spring Lake.
Yeah, in Spring Lake. And they finally got him down. But he died before, and he was charged in Baton Rouge, but the Baton Rouge police were not, it wasn't something the Baton Rouge people were as interested in as we were, because it was a long way the two cities were, and nothing happened in Baton Rouge. Well, he was shot in Baton Rouge, so I'm sure they did some stories on him. But that's the story of Dartois. Now, some people, I think there have been a couple of books written about it. And I have not read that book, but Lynn Stewart, who headed that committee, she said she read it, and she said that it was pretty good, and they gave pretty good credit to the and he gave good credit to the team. He being the state senator at that point, and I can't remember his name either. And I think he has died since then. And he was. A lot of different people worked on that at different times, but the main people were the 5 or 6 that I mentioned, who J.L. Meade, Lynn Stewart, J.L. Wilson, Orland Dodson. That was the crux of the investigative group. And the Enterprise team did other stories too. Part of it was Enterprise and part of it was investigation.
Well, if other people aren't going to say it regularly, I'm going to say it. So you're the first Pulitzer Prize nominee I've had here to date. And
well, it is exciting.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous achievement.
Yeah.
All right. So your husband, I'm gonna do my best. Your husband, Paul Schuetze.
That's correct.
Has been a critical part of both your personal and professional life, photographing much of your written coverage for the Times. Tell me a little about when and how Paul and you first met.
Paul was, this was during Vietnam, and we were 34 when both of us were 34 when we married. But he was not in Vietnam. He was a maintenance officer on the B-52s, and he he got his master's and then as soon as he almost got drafted, he was really pretty nervous because he was finishing his college degree, and he only had 6 years, the master's, and he only had 6 years before they were going to draft him. And he was from Bethesda, Maryland, which somebody told me the other day is listed in Maryland as the richest county in Maryland. That's Shreveport. Did you see that? There was some kind of listing. But anyway, so he did not get drafted. He was in the Air Force, and he was, appointed to the Air Force, and went to Thailand for a year. I told him, when he was there for the Christmas Eve bombings, that brought the North Koreans, to the peace table in Paris. And he said it was just one plane after the other, but he was, and that was involved in that bombing. Well, he was a maintenance officer, so he didn't fly. But anyway, and he kept wanting to go to Germany because his father was a German immigrant. He wanted to go to Hamburg. Well, they brought him after he finished his year in Thailand, they brought him to California. He got 2 bases there. Then they sent him to New Jersey, and then they wanted to send him somewhere in North Dakota. So he asked for another assignment, and they gave him Shreveport. And the lady living next to me at the apartment where I lived, she was related to her husband was related to his sister. And so she was just a friend. But anyway, so she would have him over for wine and cheese occasionally, so she asked me to come. And he walked in the door, and it was kind of love at first sight, really. But I told him later, he told me that he said, you had such good looking, it was mini skirt time. He said, you had such good looking legs. I said, nobody ever told me I had good looking legs, Paul. So that's how we met. And we married a year later. Now, he was a microbiologist and taught at the med school. But at one point, our photographer said, we're not going to shoot society pictures anymore, ever. They hated doing that. They wanted to win a Pulitzer taking pictures. So he said, well, I can do it. And so he technically was not good at it, but he's shot so many now, probably for about 15 years, that he's become better and better. And now people they'll all find him at a party and say, will you take our picture? So that's fun, and he's enjoying doing it a lot.
And y'all are still, so tell me kind of, this wasn't a formal question, but tell me what you're doing now. Like
Well, I was downsized about 5 years ago. That Gannett downsized a lot of people, and so I worked for a little while for the Inquisitor because John said, "You're welcome to come here if you want to." He made a big deal about it, and he, gave me. Well, he didn't give assignments. I just covered whatever I wanted to cover, similar to. Then the Times hired a new editor, and she said, if you want to come work for me, you can do that. So I freelance for the Times. And
mostly society coverage?
Mostly society. I really could do anything that I wanted to, and I have some story ideas kind of in my head that I'd like to do. But that takes a lot of time, and I just have not done any of that yet. But I plan to try. For instance, I'd like to do a thing on the homeless children. There are 2,000 homeless children in the Caddo school system, and where do they sleep and what do they do? One of who is now in college. So, and doing very well. She did very well at Huntington. So that's the kind of thing. And I just read in the New York Times a story about power rooms. Where do the bankers, when they're all, what's a power room look like? That's the kind of stuff I would like to do. So I've not done any of that yet. I mostly I covered the debutante ball. Nell Kahn came out with a book that she wrote, and she made the front page. I was really excited for her about that. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'd like to kind of start again my regular column.
And if someone's listening today and would love, has a story for Maggie, what's the best way for?
Just call me. I have two numbers, 820-7404 or 425-3124. My email is maggiemar@earthlink.net. And that's all you would have to do, would call or email me and your idea. Yeah, so
it's not often that you get the opportunity to have an actual icon cover you. So anyone listening that thinks they have a story that needs to be told, don't hesitate to call Maggie.
Or if you have an investigative story, just call me. I'll be glad to take a look at it.
Well, Maggie, those are my set questions today. I could sit here for hours. I mean, you've seen so much. You've been such an integral part of this community. Is there anything else that you want to get into or share? By all means, this is your time, and I'd love to hear anything that you want to share with us.
Well, this is something kind of interesting. A photographer and I were down there. Okay, there was a kid here who walked from Guatemala to America, and he slipped at the Texas border. Somehow there was something in the water. He was in the water, and there was something he ducked under when the border people. Well, they did finally catch him. Catch isn't a good word, and he had a cousin here, and he happened to have her phone number. And so when he was 12 years old at that point, and he had walked from Guatemala all the way in here. And so they can't just send a 12-year-old, as I understand the law, and it could have changed. And so they called her, and so she went down and got this kid. And there's a lawyer in near the prison down in south of here. It's south of here. It's where Edwin Edwards was. And she hired this lawyer. This lawyer specializes in immigration problems. And so we did the story that ran on Sunday, so everybody knew what was going on. And this is when everybody was taking the paper. And so she said she wanted me to come down. Well, we had not called the immigration people to see if we could come. So Raymond McDaniel said, just go, y'all can get it. So they wouldn't let us in the courtroom, but we sat outside. So we heard everything going on. And when the lawyer, the judge said he can stay in the United States. He could stay. They weren't going to send him home. And so they came out, the lawyer and one of the men that worked in that building, and I think it was Lee Shively, And we were standing there, and the lawyer was telling us what all had happened. Well, about that time, somebody walked out and whispered in the lawyer's ear, and the lawyer looked up and said, "You all are going to be arrested because you weren't supposed to be in there if you don't leave." And so I said, it was 5 o'clock on a Friday, and I thought my husband will say, "Well, you can just come and get home. You can spend the night there, and we'll get." And I said, "And the Times isn't going to come down in here." So Lee and I raced to his car. He said, "Maggie, if we can get off of this place, I don't think they will arrest us." He said, "Just get in the car and I'll drive us out." So he did. But that's my story about we were almost arrested. And the other thing that I like to tell that I feel are...
So what year was that, you think?
That was probably... I was saying the 80s, maybe the 70s or the 80s, yeah. And that he joined the Army and had some kind of a special assignment, so they made him immediately made him a citizen of the United States. And I haven't seen him around. They wanted to send him to learn how to fly. The Air Force did. They wanted to do a lot of things with it, but he got out of that. And I haven't talked to him since then, but I have seen him waiting tables here occasionally. His cousin is an anesthesiologist, not a doctor anesthesiologist, but she works in the operating room with anesthesiologists. When Kenny Wayne Shepherd was getting married, he was married the first time, and then this was his second. And he and his dad, Ken Shepherd, was going to try to get, they weren't going to let any press cover it. He was going to try to get me in. Well, you remember and the father of the bride, and is it Mel Gibson?
That's
yeah,
right.
That's who it is. He got stopped by the police before the wedding,
Yeah.
and that made anti-Semitic comments and things. So 2 or 3 days before, the person, one of the cousins that was related to Kenny Wayne, was invited. So I called her sister. I said, "Do you have Kitty's cell phone number?" And she said, "Yes, and I'll give it to you." And she did. And Kitty answered the phone. And I said, "This is Margaret Martin at the Times." And they had grown up on my street, so I knew them. I said, "Well, where are you?" And she said, "Well, we're fixing to go into the wedding, and I'm not supposed to talk to a reporter." I said, "Well, Kitty, just tell me can you just tell me what you're doing right now?" So she began talking, and she said, "Oh, Margaret, I am so nervous. I'm not supposed to be doing that." I said, "Well, why don't you just kind of get under a bench or get off in a corner?" and that's a specialty of mine, is interviewing people and getting them to talk and having good sources. That's always been something I could do easily. And so she did. But what is interesting about that story is, because the Times is copyrighted, anybody that ran that, nobody else had that story. Nobody in the world had that story. And because the Times is copyrighted, anybody that picked it up, People Magazine, for one, had to give credit not to me, but to the paper. So about a week later, Kenny Wayne's dad, Ken Shepherd, called me. He said, "I'm so glad you got the story, Margaret. I just could not help you. I could not help you, but I'm so glad you got it." But he said, "What I want to tell you today is that the paper in North Korea ran that story." And is it still North Korea?
Yeah.
And they had to credit the Times. So wasn't that kind of cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was, and we were the only paper that, as I said, in the world. I'm sure later other people were able to get it, but anybody that did it first time had to credit us. The other story, and a friend of mine was in the South Pacific, and she read it in a paper there. The nuns this was when there was all the changes at the Vatican with nuns and priests, and she was. I'm sorry, at St. Vincent's, 25 nuns left the order, just walked out. Well, did you know Monsignor Bordelon by any chance? No. I'm sure your parents did. He had called me and said, "Margaret, you need to go over to St. Vincent's. Sister so-and-so knows you're coming." Well, I was busy and I had a lot going on, and he called me 3 days later and he said, "Margaret, You have to go over and talk to them. I said, oh, okay, I'll go right now. So I called and went over there. And they said, we're leaving the order. And that was a major story that went on the Associated Press A-line around the world about those nuns leaving and it was so interesting because many of them had never been out. It was not a closed order, but a lot of them didn't know what to do or how to do it, so everybody was trying to help them. So that was another big story that I was covering religion at that time. That was my first assignment.
Wow.
Was the religion. I think they all thought it was an easy cover, but there was a lot of big news at that time too. So that was both of those stories pop up for me. And I covered the first of the Mardi Gras ever. That was when the Gemini started, and that was my first assignment to cover. And I covered the Revel. That was one of the first assignments. And I covered the Strand when it opened. So a lot of those kinds of stories were exciting for me to be able to do.
And tell me your earliest memory of Delton Harrison.
Well, I guess I had always Delton was some years older than me, not a lot, but some years older than me. And Delton, I always knew, you read about him. I read about him in the paper, so you knew who he was. And then he got to know who I was. So the first time I met him, he was a larger than life. Delton. He was a larger than life person. Delton was, and
Do you remember where you were the first time you met him? Do you remember where it was the first time you met him?
I probably no, I don't remember specifically where it was. I always knew who he was because it was in the paper all the time. I don't know if it was may have been a party at his house. He gave a lot of parties for a lot of nonprofit.
On Eastridge. On Eastridge.
On Eastridge, yeah. And so, my husband makes muffins at Christmas, and he just does the batter, so you put them in the oven. Well, Delton, and a lot of people heard Paul was doing that, and Delton did. And so Delton called me. He said, when are you going to bring my muffins, Margaret? Pam Atchison does a better Delton than I do. But I said, well, we're bringing them. And he said, I take them on the plane with me. He said he flies, and I think he took them in the batter. And then when he got to New York, he put them in the oven. But he always wanted to have them. And I don't know how he got on the plane with food, because you can't take water on. Maybe that was pre all the, but anyway, that's what he did. He always wanted the muffins. But he was a larger-than-life person.
Well, Maggie, so are you, and it's such a treat to have you here. You are an institution, you are an icon, and I so appreciate you making the time to be with us.
Well, I certainly enjoyed them. And I kind of got lost. I told Jeffrey I grew up in Shreveport, but I kind of got lost getting here today because the streets are changed. And I never knew the names of a lot of the streets. I just knew where everything was, where Gold Rings and Selbers and all of those. I knew where they were, and I don't know all the streets. So thank you for rescuing me.
Of course.
After I had driven to Bossier City.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for asking me. I've loved every minute of it.
Me too. Great to have you.
Thank you.